Introduction. There is a wonderful game called Mind Ball. This game is played between two players. Both wear brainwave sensing helmets and sit at the two edges of a table facing each other. A ball sits in the middle of the table. When the game starts, both players stay as calm and focused as possible. Each player's brainwaves are measured, and the player whose brain is calmer and manages to move the ball away from them until it goes all the way to the opponent's side wins. The motive force, measured by each player's electrodes and conveyed to the ball by a magnet hidden underneath the table, is the combination of alpha and theta waves produced by the brain when it's relaxed. The more alpha and theta waves you produce, the more force you mentally exert on the ball. Essentially, Mind Ball is a contest of who can be the calmest. It's fun to watch. The players visibly struggle to relax, closing their eyes, breathing deeply, adopting vaguely yogic postures. The panic they begin to feel as the ball approaches their end of the table is usually balanced out by the over-eagerness of their opponent. Both players alternately lose their cool as the big metal ball rolls back and forth. There is a widespread recognition that this tension, how to force yourself to relax, to shut off your mind when you need to, is a challenge for professional athletes or other performers. In our culture, the benefit of not trying too hard, of being in the zone, has long been appreciated by artists. The jazz great Charlie Parker is said to have advised aspiring musicians, "Don't play the saxophone. Let it play you." The same openness is also crucial in acting and other performing arts, which fundamentally rely on spontaneity and seemingly effortless responsiveness. A stand-up comedian who is not in the zone isn't funny, and an actor who is not fully inhabiting his or her role comes across as wooden and fake. Explaining how to prepare for a role, the actor Michael Caine cautions that simply memorizing the script and trying to act it out step by step will never work. When it comes time for your line, the only way to bring it off authentically is to not try to remember it. You must be able to stand there not thinking of that line. You take it off the other actor's face. He is presumably new minting the dialogue as if he himself just thought of it, by listening and watching, as if it were all new to him too. Otherwise, by your next line, you're not listening and not free to respond naturally, to act spontaneously. The importance of being in the zone is perhaps nowhere more appreciated than in professional sports, where the competitive edge provided by complete absorption is the stuff of myth. A 2005 piece in Sports Illustrated consists solely of quotations from professional basketball players about what it feels like to be in flow. "The ball feels so light, and your shots are effortless," says Pat Garrity of Orlando Magic. "You don't even have to aim. You let it go, and you know the ball is going in. It's wonderful. It's like a good dream, and you don't want to wake up. It's like an out-of-body experience, like you're watching yourself," says Joe Dumars, former NBA All-Star guard. "You almost feel like you don't even see the defense. Every move you make, you feel like, God, that guy is slow. You don't even hear the regular noise you normally hear. It's muffled. You go to practice the next day and you say, God, why can't I do that every night?" The reason professional athletes would love to bottle that feeling is that it all too easily disappears. As Dumars says, professional basketball players in the zone don't want to wake up, but they often do. Ben Gordon, formerly a guard for the Chicago Bulls, puts it like this: "When the feeling starts going away, it's terrible. I talk to myself and say, come on, you gotta be more aggressive. That's when you know it's gone. It's not intuitive anymore." Even casual athletes are familiar with the pain of falling out of the zone, or finding it just beyond their grasp. Imagine that you're in the final set of a tennis match, playing your best game ever, and about to defeat a higher-ranked opponent for the first time, and the dawning realization that you are about to win makes you begin to lose. You become tense, overly cautious. You begin to think about your swing instead of just swinging, and the opponent begins to close the gap. You know what you need to do. Just relax and get back into the groove. The more you think about relaxing, though, the more you tighten up, and you watch helplessly as your lead disappears and your opponent gets to gloat once again. Getting the mind to shut off and allow the body to do its thing is clearly a challenge we all face. We may not be subject to the same pressures as Joe Dumars or Pat Garrity, but in many ways, our sports events can be seen as a massive game of mind ball, where you can win the game only by relaxing and getting yourself into flow. Yet there is nothing magical about this state. It results from our brain's ability to anticipate, learn, and condition itself to safely, reliably, and rapidly reach the state. It is within everyone's reach, as long as you know how it works. This book will explain how flow experiences are achieved and identify conditions that make it more likely to occur. Part 1. The What of Flow. I'm trying to free your mind, Neo. Matrix. Chapter 1. What is flow? If you have experienced a moment when you were totally involved in what you were doing, a time when you felt strong and confident, not worried about yourself or about failing, you've probably experienced flow. But what is flow? Well, first of all, flow is a state of consciousness where one becomes totally absorbed in what one is doing. A state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. So, flow is about focus? More than just focus. Flow is a harmonious experience where mind and body are working together effortlessly, leaving the person with a feeling that something special has just occurred. So, flow is about enjoyment? Although a person in flow might be too busy to notice it during a performance, enjoyment is often the most well-remembered and treasured aspect of the experience. The enjoyment that flow provides is often described as the lift, because once you get it, it just lifts you up towards a superior performance. So, flow is about optimal performance. Athletes use a wide range of terms to describe the performance aspect of flow. Some mention the feeling of invincibility. Others meet high challenges with unwavering confidence, allowing previously unimaginable events to occur. So, flow is about peak experiences. Although a high-level performance is important, flow does not depend on it, and flow offers something more than just a successful outcome. This is because flow lifts experience from the ordinary to the optimal, and it is in those moments that we truly feel alive and in tune with what we are doing. So flow is exclusively for sports performances. Flow is a state with universal qualities that is experienced by people in a wide range of contexts. A great game of tennis, a fabulous downhill race is similar to how you feel when you're reading a gripping novel, playing a close game of chess, or other events that require mental effort. Despite the enormous differences between the activities, the experience of people being totally involved in what they are doing is characterized by a common set of features. Surgeons performing a life-and-death operation, chess players working out their next moves, or climbers scaling a mountain peak, all describe a consistent set of feelings that psychologists like Csikszentmihalyi identify as flow components. In part 1 of the book, we describe 10 of these components and illustrate them with real-time events and study cases of elite sport athletes. It's here that we'll see how flow works in the brain, how it massively accelerates athletic performance. Part 2 of the book focuses on the experience of flow, what athletes report when they're in flow, and the science behind these feelings. Part 3 of the book provides you with the mindset needed for flow. And finally, in Part 4 of the book, when we figure out what these athletes are doing to reliably produce this state, then we can apply this knowledge in our domain. Despite the unusual them at the center of the stories, this book is really about us, you and me. Case Study 1. The Impossible in Surfing. It was a sunny day in 2000 when surf legend Laird Hamilton was about to surf Chopu. Chopu sits a quarter-mile off the southwestern coast of Tahiti. Unlike the deep-water big-wave breaks of Mavericks and Pihai, Chopu explodes laterally onto a highly shallow, razor-sharp reef, producing a barrel that has accurately been compared to the Lincoln Tunnel. It's also the heaviest wave in the world, the most mass, the most power, the most ferocity. The website Surfline might have said it best. This isn't your father's perfect wave. And unless seeing your next birthday doesn't rank on your list of priorities, it isn't yours either. Hamilton was about to ride that wave, but the swell was big when he got to the beach. Too big. The day started out with us being told Chopu was completely unrideable, recalls Hamilton in a video interview. They said, "We don't go out there when it's like this. But all the people who do what we do, who do the things that no one has before, we're not the type to accept that answer. Either way, we have to try it." And by we, he means, of course, himself. Hamilton tucked his feet into his toe straps, grabbed hold of a tow rope, and headed out of this famed lineup. Hawaiian big wave charger Derek Dorner was piloting the jet ski. I remember letting go of the rope just as Double D, aka Derek Dorner, yelled out, "Don't let go." I remember seeing the magnitude of the wave as it stood up, a double wall, and then putting myself into position, and the time just stood still. Then it was like I had an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other as I thought about what I should do next. And they were saying, "Jump off, stay on, jump off, stay on." Eventually, the angel won, and I stayed on. It was like a dam bursting, like someone had dropped the seafloor by 30 feet, and the ocean was desperately trying to find level ground. So much force was being generated that Hamilton, as he was trying to get into position for the tube ride, found himself getting sucked up the wave's face. To hold steady, he had to reach down to the outside of the surfboard and drag his right hand in the water. It was the perfect move, and the only reason he's alive today. But here's the thing. No one had ever made that move before. Laird had to drag this backhand, says former surfer editor Sam George in Stacy Peralta's film Riding Giants, on the opposite side of the board to keep himself from getting sucked up in that hydraulic. In the middle of that maelstrom, how did his mind say this is what I have to do? No one has ever ridden as Hamilton on that wave before. He couldn't practice. So it was his imagination dealing with that unimaginable and coming up with a plan spontaneously. And then things got really crazy. That unpredictable and suddenly appearing killer wave cantilevered into the reef, and the resulting thunderclap splash went off like a megaton bomb. Shock waves pulsed into the channel. The spray shot up almost 60 feet. As far as anyone could tell, Hamilton had been swallowed whole. Seconds later, though, the mist parted, and out he rode, tall and triumphant. It is no exaggeration to say nothing has been the same since. Continues George. Laird's wave at Chopu was the single most significant ride in surfing history. The Millennium Wave changed human perception of what is possible from a surfing perspective, but it also changed Laird Hamilton. I think the only limits are the limits we put on ourselves, Hamilton continues. I think there is really no limit to what we're potentially capable of riding, as long as the equipment keeps evolving and the evolution of our technique keeps evolving. Hopefully, one thing is clear. Flow is that evolving technique. This may raise up an important question. What is flow exactly? Chapter 2. Flow Components. To be as precise as I can, I have to begin with that there is no agreed definition of the term, nor does flow fit comfortably into the standard definition of an optimal state of consciousness. Here's why. Traditionally, researchers divide consciousness into sleep, waking, and dreaming, then further subdivide by degrees of focus and alertness. The results are a progression of attentional categories from total unresponsiveness of a vegetative coma to the hypervigilance of the fight-or-flight response. Flow states fall on this scale, but not exactly. The zone requires attention, but of a particular kind. When it comes to flow, concentration is nearly total. Laird Hamilton saw every nuance of detail of the wave's face. Yet beyond this field, his awareness dropped off precipitously, i.e., he never heard the cries of warning coming from the spectators in this channel. Hamilton was hypervigilant and totally unresponsive, and both at the same time. So, unlike most other states of consciousness defined by a singular type of attention, flow breaks boundaries, tapping multiple categories at once. Despite the changing nature of the state, so consistent are its various features that researcher and psychologist Csikszentmihalyi shifted through his data and isolated 10 core components that define the state. Here's the list. 1. A sense of personal control over the situation. 2. A loss of the feeling of self. 3. Distorted sense of time. 4. The activity is intrinsically rewarding. 5. Total absorption in what one does. 6. A lack of awareness of bodily needs. 7. A high degree of concentration. 8. Clear goals. We know what to do, and we know where to focus our attention while doing it. 9. Immediate feedback. Successes and failures are apparent, so behavior can be adjusted as needed in the moment. And 10. The balance between challenge and skill. The situation feels challenging, yet manageable. The first 7 elements describe the subjective experience during an activity in flow. They are the outcomes that characterize flow. They will be discussed in part 2 of the book. The last 3 components, clear goals, immediate feedback, and the balance between challenge and skill, are essential properties that could be coined as internal conditions for flow to occur. We'll discuss them in part 4 of the book. Moreover, Csikszentmihalyi uses the term microflow and macroflow to explain the variations. In macroflow, all of the 10 elements arrive at once. It's the full chopu. It's Hamilton in flow state while writing chopu, where it means find the zone or suffer the consequences. On the other hand, microflow is what occurs when only a few of these categories are fulfilled. Say, clear goals, concentration, and absorption. Or what would happen if Hamilton paddled out for an afternoon of mellow Hawaiian surf. Other researchers validated the 10 components mentioned above, and they form as close a definition of flow as anyone has yet produced. Yet if we're really hunting for a working definition of flow, the place to start may not even be with those different components, but rather with its practical value. The practical value of flow. Within Hamilton's experience of writing chopu, we already discovered 3 of these basic qualities of flow: the creative insight provided by the state, the pulling off of the difficult move that saved his life, the profound mental clarity provided by the state, note the calm, rational nature of the mental argument, and a hint of its intuitive nature, how one right decision always leads to the next right decision. Let's start with exploring them one by one. Here is Csikszentmihalyi's definition of the zone: being completely involved in an activity for its own sake. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. What is jazz? It's an acoustic result of high-speed problem-solving or near-perfect decision-making. And flow is a highly efficient and effective decision-making mechanism. After all, as Hamilton himself pointed out, if the angel and the devil arguing on his shoulder had reached the wrong decision, we'd still be picking pieces of him out of Chopu's reef. But how does flow enable us to make such good decisions? That's where neuroscience comes in. Chapter 3. The Neuroscience of Flow. Leslie Sherlin studies the brains of people making decisions. Very good decisions. He's one of the world's leading experts in the neuroelectricity of high performance, explicitly focusing on qualitative electroencephalography, EEG. Whenever you encounter stimuli, or have a thought, explained Sherlin in The Rise of Superman, the brain has an electrical response. EEG measures those responses down to the 1/1000th of a second range, which allows us to track how the brain changes across time. When someone is making a decision, and this can be an athlete solving a problem or an artist solving an aesthetic one, we can see everything that leads up to a decision, the decision itself, and everything that happens as a result. As those electric responses occur in bursts, they create waves. Brain waves is what an EEG actually measures. There are 5 major brainwave types measured by an EEG, each correlating to a different state of consciousness. Delta, the slowest brainwave, meaning the one with the longest pauses between bursts of electricity, is found between 1 Hz and 3.9 Hz. When someone is in a deep, dreamless sleep, they're in delta. Next up, between 4 Hz and 7.9 Hz, is theta, which correlates to REM sleep, meditation, insight, and, as often as necessary for insight, the processing of novel incoming stimuli. Between 8 Hz and 13.9 Hz hovers alpha, the brain's basic resting state. You're relaxed, calm, and vivid in alpha, but not really thinking. Beta sits between 14 Hz and 30 Hz, and implies learning and concentration at the low end, fear and stress at the high end. Above 30 Hz, there's a fast-moving wave known as gamma, which only shows up during binding, when different parts of the brain combine disparate thoughts into a single idea. The EEG is very good at detecting networks. The technology can see which parts of the brain are talking to one another at any given time. Thus, when decisions are being made, EEG can help determine the structure of his network detection ability that provides us with our first neurological insight into a flow experience. Csikszentmihalyi used EEG to examine the brains of chess masters mid-game. He found a significant decrease in activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain housing most of our higher cognitive functions, such as problem-solving, reasoning, and decision-making. This may seem surprising. Chess is a game of logic, planning, and strategy, 3 things that appear to require higher cognitive functions. But this isn't the only way the brain can make decisions. Neuroanatomy of flow. Human beings have evolved 2 different systems for processing information. The first, the explicit system, is rule-based, expressed verbally, and ties to conscious awareness. When the prefrontal cortex is fired up, the explicit system is usually turned on. But when the cold calculus of logic is swapped out for the gut sense of intuition, this is the implicit system at work. This implicit system relies on skill and experience, and is not consciously accessible, and cannot be described verbally, i.e., try to explain a hunch. These 2 systems are often described as conscious versus unconscious, or left brain versus right brain. There are 2 advantages to the brain using the implicit system. The first is speed. When the brain finds a task it needs to solve, writes Baylor neuroscientist David Eagleman in Incognito, it rewires its own circuitry until it can accomplish this task with maximum efficiency. The task becomes burned into the machinery. Automation permits fast decision-making. Only when the slow system of consciousness is pushed to the back of the queue can rapid programs do their work. Should I wing forehand or backhand at the approaching tennis ball? With a 90-mile-per-hour projectile on its way, one does not want to cognitively slog through the different options. Efficiency is the second advantage. Our brain is 2% of our body weight, yet consumes 20% of our energy. Eagleman continues. As a result, it's always looking for ways to converse. Using the explicit system to think through decisions burns a lot of calories, but switching to the implicit minimizes the energy required to solve problems, so therefore, it's very efficient. This is also why Csikszentmihalyi found little activity in the prefrontal cortex of chess masters. After years of playing, they'd internalize board patterns and move sequences, and didn't have to rely on their conscious mind to work through every option. Instead, their explicit system went offline, and the implicit system turned on. Since low alpha, high theta is the dominant brainwave produced by the implicit system, this frequency has long been considered the signature of high performance. In the zone, says Sherlin, you still see the same fluidity in the transitions between states. but you also see even more control. Instead of producing all these other brainwaves, really great athletes can transition smoothly into the zone, creating that high theta, low alpha wave, and then hold themselves there, sort of in suspended animation, shutting out the conscious mind and letting the implicit system do its stuff. To illustrate this further, consider Hamilton's experience on the Millennium Wave. Before he grabbed the tow rope, he assessed the situation, trying to predict the future. Feeling fear, the classic beta. But once he was pulled toward the wave, when he started to shut out outside stimuli and focus on the task at hand, that's a burst of alpha, and Hamilton's transition into flow. The angel-devil argument was really about alpha versus beta. The angel was alpha. It was the implicit system saying, let's go for it. We know what to do. The devil was beta. It was the explicit system saying, hold up a second, let's just gather more data. But the angel won. Hamilton suppressed that beta wave and got himself to alpha theta, the signature of the flow state, and held himself there. Of course, the Millennium Wave didn't end when Hamilton found the zone. Moments later, he was getting sucked up by that wave's face. So while the implicit system is capable of high-speed pattern recognition, which helped him realize what was happening a little sooner, it took more than just that to survive. He still had to have a creative insight no one had ever had before, and pull off a tricky move that no one had ever attempted before. It was an impossible within an impossible already, which makes one wonder how it could have happened. Turns out, over the past decade, we've learned a great deal about how flow makes such things possible, and more fitting within the premises of this book, how flow makes the impossible possible for us. Not surprisingly, our creativity lies deeply rooted in the right side of the brain, the side dominated by the implicit system. The reason has to do with the structure of neural networks. When the explicit system, left side of the brain, handles a problem, the neurons involved are very close to one another. This proximity leads to linear connections, logical deductions, and all the other keystones of standard reasoning. When the implicit system is at work, its reaches are much broader, far-flung corners of the brain that are in communication to one another. This is known to experts as lateral thinking, which means solving problems by a creative approach, typically through viewing the issue in a new and unusual light. It also means that novel stimuli can combine with random thoughts and vague memories that result in something entirely new. And this means creative problem solving. Creativity and flow. Creativity has a brainwave signature as well, alpha waves pulsing out of the brain's right hemisphere. This is considered the readiness state for sudden insight, meaning not the revelation itself, rather its precursor conditions. That Hamilton never panicked may also play a role. It now seems that without a calm, relaxed frame of mind, the brain is incapable of switching from beta-dominant localized networks to alpha-driven widespread webs. But this isn't where the process ends. When Hamilton pulled off the move on the Chopu wave, that moment of sudden insight comes with a different brainwave signature. Exactly 30 milliseconds before that breakthrough intuition arrives, EEG shows a burst of gamma waves. These ultra-fast brainwaves appear when many widely distributed cells, i.e. novel stimuli, random thoughts, and vague memories, bind themselves together into a brand new network. It is the brainwave signature of the aha moment. The interesting thing about a gamma spike, explains Leslie Sherlin, is that it always happens inside of theta oscillations. The two waves are coupled. It makes sense. Theta processes novel incoming stimuli. Gamma happens when those stimuli snap together into new ideas. But it's hard to do any of this on command. This is where athletes in flow have a huge edge. Their brain is already in alpha theta. They're holding themselves in the only state that can produce that gamma spike. When you add all these elements together, it's easy to see why flow is such an effective decision-making strategy. Not only does it elevate our problem-solving abilities, but by holding themselves in low alpha, high theta needed to produce that gamma spike, people in the zone are already neurologically poised on the brink of a breakthrough. This means flow packs a double punch. It doesn't just increase our decision-making ability, It increases our creative problem-solving abilities as well. High stakes into flow. By now, you'll understand that the people most likely to tap into a high-intensity state are action sports athletes, while putting their life in danger. The experience of flow, a dilated sense of time, hyper-awareness of yourself and what you're doing, clarity of mind, is similar to the feeling of time dilation experienced at near-death experiences. This may not be accidental. In near-death situations, our brain goes into overdrive to increase our chances of making it through. Extreme sports fanatics tap into this state more easily than other people due to taking the shortcut by actually creating these life-and-death situations. It's either get into the zone or suffer the consequences. If you want to experience the high-intensity state flow without risking your life, you're out of luck. Just kidding. When people think about action and adventure sports athletes, the first thing, often the only thing they think about, is the physical risk involved. But the greatest athletes aren't interested in the greatest risks. I mean, they do take physical risks, but those physical risks are a stepping stone of a much deeper desire: creative self-expression. In action and adventure sports, creativity is always the point. When you're out skiing or skating with your friends, explains action sports writer Micah Abrams, if you see your friend do something mind-bending, there's a natural inclination to immediately want to try it, immediately want to add to it. Everyone builds off each other's creativity. In action and adventure sports, it's all about creativity. There are a great number of risks that can get you into flow, with taking a physical risk being only one of them. Every time we have a creative idea and share it with the world, we come up against some very primal risks: risk of failure, risk of social ridicule, risk of criticism, risk of rejection. Writing this book is a considerable risk. Risk of loss of resources, time, money, opportunity costs. Starting a company is considered one of the riskiest and most creative acts in business. There is significant risk involved in every step of the process. Once danger becomes its own reward, wrote Stephen Kotler in The Rise of Superman. Risk moves from a threat to be avoided to a challenge to be risen toward. An entirely new relationship with fear begins to develop. When the risk is a challenge, fear becomes a compass, literally pointing people in the direction they need to go, i.e., the direction that produces more flow. By now, you know that there's a risk involved to get you into a flow state, but place yourself in two risky situations, and no flow. Back to square one. Struggle, anxiety, arousal, restlessness. All this results from excess production of stress hormones, such as secretions, adrenaline, norepinephrine, cortisol, and other stress-related hormones. This, accompanied by the potentially destructive flight-or-flight response, will drag you down into mediocre performance and perhaps even damage your health. The fight-or-flight response, aka a cocktail of adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine, is an extreme stress response. The brain switches to reactive survival autopilot, and options are limited to 3: fight, flee, or freeze. Flow is the opposite of that. It's a creative problem-solving state. Options are wide open. Yet there are reasons for the confusion. The two states are linked. Risk heightens focus, and flow follows focus. This means that the fight-or-flight response primes your body, chemically and psychologically, for a flow state. Athletes report moving through one to get to the other. For example, when Hamilton pushes off of Chopu, he has seconds to flip the switch from the fight-or-flight response to the relaxation response. If he can follow his focus into flow, he lives to ride another day. But if panic swaps the circuitry, we'd still be picking up pieces of him out of Chopu's reef. Once I drop into the wave, recalls Hamilton, it becomes automatic, like driving a car. That's when I calm down, when my conscious mind snaps off and I dive into the zone. The relaxation response, according to experiments run by Harvard cardiologist Herbert Benson, is flow's real trigger. More on that in part 3. But how did Hamilton manage to get himself into flow while riding the mother of all waves? This all has to do with what scientists call situational awareness. Training in high-stress situations increases what psychologists call situational awareness. Defined as the ability to absorb information accurately assess it calmly, and respond appropriately. Situational awareness is essentially the ability to keep cool when all hell breaks loose. When we look at Chopu and other big waves, we feel this overwhelming fear, dread, and awe, because that's what evolution designed us to feel. But that's not what Hamilton felt, or at least to say, he wasn't overwhelmed by the fear. It was just a couple percentage out of his comfort zone. You need to know that Hamilton grew up in Hawaii. His father, Bill Hamilton, considered the most stylish surfer of his era, had no problem taking his son to the beach. The beach was the legendary Bonsai Pipeline, one of the more vicious breaks in surfing. But the pipeline was Bill's playground. Thus, it became Laird's as well. People always ask me if I feel fear in the big waves, says Hamilton. Of course I'm afraid. If I went out in 50-foot surf and I'm not feeling fear, then I'm not properly assessing the situation. But it's different when you're raised in these conditions. When I was a kid, I was rescued every 4 or 5 days at the pipeline. The currents would catch me and drag me out, and the lifeguard would have to come to get me. Eventually, they got so pissed off, they told my father to lock me up while he surfed. Equally insidious is how flow prepares us to handle these risky challenges. In this state, our skills are peaking, our inner critic is shut down, and our ability to feel fear is significantly dampened. I felt I could not be hurt, wrote Brazilian soccer star Pelé in his autobiography My Life and the Beautiful Game. Perhaps it was merely confidence. But I have felt confident many times before without that strange feeling of invincibility. The feeling of invincibility. Exercising control in difficult situations is very satisfying. It leads to feeling powerful and a sense of being able to make a difference. This is where the enjoyment from the control aspect of flow comes from. Not from exerting control when nothing or very little is at stake, but doing so when the challenges are extending beyond the present reach. You can't imagine anything going wrong, wrote the iconic Manchester United and England star Gary Neville in his autobiography, Red. Like my opposite number was a very good player, probably one of the best 2 wingers in the world. At the start of the game, I could imagine myself missing him in tackles, whereas at the end of the game, there was no way that he was ever going to beat me. Even though he's probably a far better player, I couldn't even consider that at the end of the game. Another aspect of feeling invincible is a tremendous sense of calm. I just had a feeling of absolute calm. Neville continued. Like everything's going right for you. That whatever you're going to do, even your teammates, you knew that they were going to do it right. Sometimes in team sports, one or more teammates can create a momentum that helps to bring about a team flow. Because so many more factors need to be right, team flow in sports is more difficult to attain. Still, when it occurs, the team members all being in tune with one another, the performance can be a very special experience. Flow allows athletes to fully partake in their sports without holding back for fear or failure or embarrassment. Whether experienced by an individual athlete or a team, flow provides freedom from concerns that things may not work out. The feeling is really wild, wrote figure skater Michelle Kwan in Heart of the Champion. You feel like you completely abandon everything. You push harder than you ever push. You're not afraid that anything bad is going to happen. This lack of fear, lack of restraint, is really what the feeling of control and flow is all about. The sensation these athletes describe is another of flow's defining characteristics, and quite a paradox. The paradox is real control in places we should have none. The expression control is easily misunderstood. It can put many people off by its association with compulsive domination or nervous attention. Control and flow has none of these qualities. It is a state of security and relaxation, with a complete absence of worry. The paradox known in Zen Buddhism as control without controlling. The sense of control is ultimately a byproduct of autonomy, being free to do what you want, and competence, being good at what you do. It's about getting to choose your own challenges and having the necessary skills to surmount them. In addition, because flow is so enjoyable, we tend to seek out situations where we can expect it. This necessarily involves developing greater skills and taking on increasingly greater challenges. Furthermore, in increasing the intensity of the feeling, you are led to increasingly higher levels of athletic performance. Understanding flow, however, offers more than the development of athletic performance. Once the keys to flow are understood, the opportunity to develop one's whole life begins to emerge. At that point, it becomes possible to transform the entirety of life from a stressful and chaotic chase into something resembling an enjoyable dance. When everything goes away, as if it almost happens in slow motion and nothing else matters, then you're in flow. The audience fades away. Michelle Kwan continues. Except for the brief moment when they're clapping so loudly. Actually, that's even part of the experience. It never takes you out of focus. The merging of action and awareness has almost a mystical feeling. It's what Zen monks try to achieve or yogis aim to reach with their meditative practices. Basketball players become one with the ball. Cyclists see their bike as an extension of their bodies. Jazz musicians feel the music, the audience, the total environment. We're getting ahead to the experience of flow, and therefore part 2 of the book. But before we go into the characteristics of flow, there is still one component missing in our quest to map out the practical value of flow: the faster learning ability in flow. Certainly, what we learn from Hamilton's experience is that flow is the secret to ultimate human performance. Yet riding the Millennium Wave lasted less than 2 minutes. The quest in this book isn't about how flow helps these athletes do the impossible once. It's about long-term mastery, not short-term success. And a certain question most certainly answered in Stephen Kotler's Search for Mastery. Chapter 4. Mastery sans misery. By now, most people have heard of the 10,000-hour rule, that to truly excel at something, you need to put in 10,000 hours of deliberate effort. Besides how good you actually need to get at specific skills to enjoy using them, this myth has been debunked by now. Or, at least, research has shown that it's not the only way to attain mastery. In Kotler's book, The Rise of Superman, he challenges a few myths of mastery, telling us that it's not so much about having the right DNA or the willpower to delay gratification for 10,000 hours. As Kotler puts it, through flow, we can achieve mastery sans the misery. Here's how he puts it. When doing what we most love transforms us into the best possible version of ourselves, and that version hints at even greater future possibilities, the urge to explore those possibilities becomes a feverish compulsion. Intrinsic motivation goes through the roof. Thus, flow becomes an alternative path to mastery, sans the misery. Forget 10,000 hours of delayed gratification. Flow junkies turn instant gratification into their North Star, putting in far more hours of practice time by gleefully harnessing their hedonic impulse. In other words, when it comes to time perspectives, flow allows presence to achieve future's results. According to Kotler, these extreme sports athletes flip their approaches on their heads as they take an alternative path to their superhuman abilities. First, let's do a quick review of how Kotler challenges the various paths to mastery. He tells us that the traditional hypotheses explaining the various paths to mastery can be summed up with 3 M's: mothers, musicians, marshmallows. This famed trilogy represents the best ideas about the path of mastery. In short, the mother's theory tells us mastery is all about a nurturing environment. The musician's theory tells us we need to put in 10,000 hours of structured or deliberate practice. The marshmallows theory tells us we need to delay gratification to pursue long-term goodness. Kotler tells us a lot of these athletes came from broken families. Sorry, mothers. Didn't have the deliberate, well-structured practice at the heart of the 10,000-hour hypothesis. Sorry, musicians. And were the kind of impulsive kids who definitely would have snatched that one marshmallow rather than wait for 2. Sorry, marshmallow. They did have an absolute love of what they did, and their feeling when they entered flow. So, that's the first half of his alternative theory for attaining mastery. Now, for the second. Presence versus futures. Kotler tells us that there are two main types of people when it comes to time orientation: presents and futures. Presents are the people who want it all now. They're the ones who snatch the one marshmallow for immediate gratification. They tend to be impulsive, and they have a tough time with long-range planning. On the other hand, futures are the people who can delay gratification. They can make long-range plans and commit to mastery. But because they're so future-oriented, they tend to burn themselves out by not enjoying the process. Enter the power of flow to help both of these orientations. After 3 decades of research, Kotler found that the healthiest, happiest, highest performers blend the best of both worlds. The optimal time perspective combines the energy, joy, and openness of presence with the strength, fortitude, and long-term vision of futures. Once the sensation seekers jump on the flow path, they don't need to delay gratification to achieve success. Gratification becomes their path to success. Need some proof to back up the accelerated progression seen on the flow path? Case Study 2. The Impossible in Skateboarding. The impossible in question occurred during the final round of skateboarding's best trick competition. Tony Hawk was squaring off against Bob Burnquist, Buck Lasik, Colin McKay, and Andy McDonald. In his first run, Hawk landed a 720, meaning he rode up the ramp backward, launched into the air, spun around twice, then flipped his board 180 degrees, landing forward with his board now facing backward. It was a hell of a trick, perhaps not enough to win. Everyone was throwing down hard that night. But all Hawk had prepared. The fact that he nailed it on his first run left him 15 minutes of the contest to try whatever the hell he wanted. And what he wanted was the 900. The 900 was the great impossible of skate. 2.5 rotations. It requires massive amplitude and dizzying commitment. The landing's mostly blind. The falls, terrifying. Hawk had been chasing the trick for 13 painful years. Never had he pulled one off, nor had anyone else, though Danny Way came exceptionally close in 1989. And honestly, at the X Games, Hawk didn't think he would break that losing streak. But with the crowd all amped up, his original intention was to just put on a show. It was a show, all right. Hawk missed on his first attempt, but something was different. The spin felt more solid than ever before, and he made a decision. Either he nailed the trick or ended the night in the hospital. Everything blanked out except the 9. Hawk later wrote in his autobiography, Occupation Skateboarder. Hawk finally nailed the 900. The crowd went nuts. The real world as well. Major papers ran headlines featuring Hawk's name. Every skater on the planet heard the news. Or that is, almost every skater. Tom Schaar didn't hear the news. Then again, when Tony landed his 9, Tom wasn't yet born. Schaar was born 3 months later, on September 14th, 1999. A tow-headed kid from Malibu, California. He started skating by the time he was 5 years old. By the time he was 9, he was attempting 540s, 1.5 rotations. This alone is unfathomable. For an entire generation of skaters, the 540 was the dividing line. Tom Schaar, though, learned the move in under a year, landing his first 540 at just 10 years old. And later that year, he landed his first 720, 2 rotations. That was also the year he rode down the mega ramp for the first time. The mega ramp is a large-scale version of a vert ramp used for big air skateboarding. He thought that he should give the 900 a try with all that height and speed. It was a slightly ridiculous notion. Only 6 other people beside Hawk had landed the trick. Schaar was then 12 years old when he decided to give it a try. 3 months later, he had the move down, and he was still only 12 years old. As if breaking a new boundary within the sport wasn't enough, Tom used the mega ramp in 2012 to land the first ever 1080, breaking Tony Hawk's record 900 on a vert ramp. Afterward, he commented to ESPN.com. It was the hardest trick I've ever done, but it was easier than I thought. And this is not where the story ends. In 2019, Mitchie Brusco became the first person to land a 1260, 3 full and 1/2 rotation. I try not to think about anything. He says, I just try to let my body do the work. My body knows how to do it better than my brain, so I kind of just let it take over. This is to say, this new generation are already a generation of flow hackers. This may not sound like much, but other pros faced a hard choice. Learn to get yourself in flow, or quit the game. Many athletes didn't experiment with the mental game until later in their careers, usually only after being forced in that direction by injury. These young athletes dreamed up the impossible, then used flow to pull that vision out of their subconscious and into material existence. What is it that makes the impossible possible for the next generation of flow hackers? Two things here. The first concern, their lack of fear. Can you do something? Who knows? Let me go try. They're too young to know what to be afraid of. And the second cause of flow is transient hypofrontality, the significant decrease in the prefrontal cortex. Children are developmentally hypofrontal, meaning portions of their neocortex are not fully formed. The brain keeps developing until age 25, making them even more flow-prone. More than that, the autotelic nature of the activity, doing it for its own sake, is the source of intrinsic motivation. When Tom Schaar says, I love being with my friends at the skate park, that's the greatest feeling. What he's actually saying is, no one has to force him to practice. Part 2. Being in flow. The characteristics of flow. Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. The Wizard of Oz. Chapter 5. A loss of the feeling of self and time. When we're in a flow state, we use less of our brain, specifically our prefrontal cortex. This phenomenon is known as transient hypofrontality. The performance of the prefrontal cortex reduces significantly when we are in flow. Our prefrontal cortex is responsible for helping us perceive the passage of time. Because flow deactivates large parts of the prefrontal cortex, many of these areas are offline, thus distorting our ability to compute time. And those moments really do feel psychic. We hear plenty of familiar echoes. Recall, for example, how Hamilton describes the experience of riding Chopu or other big waves. When you're in the moment, there's no beginning and no end. It starts off where it let off. When you go to that place, there's no time, no sense of self. It's just pure. With the deactivation of our prefrontal cortex, we lose our sense of time. The same thing happens to our sense of self. We lose all judgments about ourselves in the state of flow, even that nagging self-critic, or what psychologists often refer to as ego. Why this happens comes down to the shutting down of the superior frontal gyrus, SFG, a tiny part of the prefrontal cortex. The SFG helps produce our sense of self, that introspective sense of self, which is not always helpful. If there is a sudden danger, such as the appearance of a snake, it's helpful not to stand around worrying how one feels about the situation. Another breakthrough occurred in 2008, when neuroscientist John Hopkins and Charles Limb began using fMRI to examine the brain of improv jazz musicians and freestyle rappers immersed in flow. He found the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also deactivated in the state. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is an area of the brain best known for self-monitoring and impulse control. Both not very helpful in a flow state. Self-monitoring is the voice of doubt and disparagement, our inner critic. The job of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is to ask questions, to start the process of second-guessing. It is the enemy of flow hunters everywhere. Impulse control, meanwhile, is another enemy. In normal life, our ability to resist temptation is critical to survival. But flow is an action state. If we are trying to control our impulses, hesitation would creep into the process. The result would be much less doing, and, for athletes like Hamilton, far more dying. There's also a flip side to these events. While parts of the prefrontal cortex are shutting down, others are ramping up, shaping the experience. Charles Limb, for example, found that flow activates the medial prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain that governs creative self-expression. This is the reason that people in the zone still have individual styles. So even with self-awareness out of the way, our personal preferences still leak through. That's why, for example, the two jazz icons Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane both experienced flow as an automatic process, but their sax solos didn't sound the same. The result is liberation, and we act without hesitation. Creativity becomes more free-flowing, risk-taking less frightening. The voice of intuition. Everybody who has ever been in a flow state has heard it, a voice very different from the mind's usual chatter. So what is the voice? Carl Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious, and the voice is the end result of that perception, meaning the unconscious mind broadcasting its perception to the conscious mind. Of course, it's not always a voice. Some people see images, others get strong feelings. Occasionally, the information arrives by multiple channels, and that information arrives constantly. Intuition is a permanent feature of standard brain function, meaning the voice is always communicating with us, yet we can barely hear it. The data is diluted and distorted by everything else the mind is considering. But in flow, the signal is stronger, the message is clearer, and for those on the receiving end, the feeling accompanying that broadcast is often one of profound relief, a sense that finally, at long last, someone else is driving this bus. Perhaps intuition is the most profound quality one can experience in a flow state, an experience in which we become so involved in an activity, we totally forget ourselves and the sense of time, or an activity in which we spend a long time practicing and suddenly find we can perform the task effortlessly and with perfection. We can all remember struggling with a problem over a period of time, only to find the answer in a moment of insight. When I say perfection, I really do mean perfection. Flow is the hallmark of high performance, where perfection is the only choice, and flow is the only guarantee of perfection. The distortion of time, the disappearance of self, and that strange voice that Einstein refers to as a sacred gift are among flow's more famous qualities. Why this happens comes down to hypofrontality. Transient hypofrontality. Understanding how the brain produces this peculiarity has been a long-time goal of flow researchers. Unfortunately, until recently, there has been issues. Neuroanatomy for starters. The brain is complex and specialized. Different areas do different jobs. So understanding how the brain produces an experience requires understanding what parts of the brain are involved in that production. For most of the past century, our imaging technologies weren't up to the task. Neither were our researchers, to be honest. In other words, the scientists who were interested in studying flow states weren't always that good at having flow states. With neither a technological nor personal window into the experience, the result was a black box and a big puzzle. Arne Dietrich, a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Georgia, faced neither of these problems. Dietrich was born in Germany. He spent several years globetrotting, climbing mountains, competing in Ironmans, and training over 30 hours. A lifestyle only interrupted by the occasional date and a few phone calls to his mother. As a lifelong athlete and a professor in cognitive neuroscience, he had actual knowledge of the zone. And this led to questions. For starters, which part of the brain produces flow? The prevailing research has centered on the prefrontal cortex. This makes sense. The prefrontal cortex is the heart of our higher cognitive abilities. It's the place where we collect data, problem solve, plan ahead, assess risks, evaluate rewards, analyze thoughts, suppress urges, learn from experience, make moral decisions, and give rise to our usual sense of self. And since the zone is a state of heightened performance and enhanced decision-making, it seems apparent to scientists that the entire prefrontal cortex was involved, arguably functioning at a maximum level. But this didn't track with Dietrich's experience. The prefrontal cortex is where thinking happens, he explains. It's where we take ideas and add all kinds of layers of complexity to them. But I was slipping into flow regularly and always amazed by the clarity of the state. All that complexity was gone. Decisions were easy and automatic. It was like the opposite of thinking. So Dietrich started to wonder how the brain becomes so active to process all that information. This was when it dawned to him. The brain wasn't more active. "We had it backward," he says. In flow, parts of the prefrontal cortex aren't becoming hyperactive. Parts of it are temporarily deactivating. It's an efficiency exchange. We're trading energy usually used for higher cognitive functions for heightened attention and situational awareness. The technical term for this exchange is transient hypofrontality, with hypo, meaning slow, being the opposite of hyper, i.e., fast. In flow, which parts of the brain become hypofrontal determines the nature of the experience. The more significant the deactivation of neuronal structures, the more profound and bizarre the experience. With self and time erased from the picture, all that complexity that Dietrich mentioned is edited out. It's not that the voice is turned up louder in the zone, it's that everything that stands between us and the message is removed from the picture. This is why the voice comes through so clearly in a flow state. This mystical experience is underpinned by a feeling of oneness, clarity, intensity, and surrender. This may beg another question. What is the experience of oneness? Chapter 6. The Experience of Oneness. Jefferson University neuroscientist Andrew Newberg and the University of Pennsylvania neuropsychologist Eugene De Aquili gave us our first real insight into the experience of oneness. Back in 1991, they were investigating a different version of oneness, the kind produced by meditation. In deep contemplative states, Tibetan Buddhists report absolute unitary being, or the feeling of becoming one with everything, while Franciscan nuns experience unia mystica, meaning oneness with God's love. So Newberg and De Aquili put both Buddhists and nuns inside a single emission computed tomography, SPECT, scanner, to figure out if there's a biology beneath this spirituality. The SPECT scan revealed biology all right, and hyperfrontality to be exact. In moments of intense concentration, the same efficiency exchange that erases our sense of self and distorts our sense of time begins to impact our relationship with space. This hypofrontality occurs farther back in the cortex, in the superior parietal lobe, to be exact, instead of taking place in the prefrontal lobes, in a portion of the brain that Newberg and De Aquili dubbed as the Orientation Association Area, OAA, because it helps us orient in space. When functioning normally, the OAA is a navigation system. It judges angles and distances, maps course trajectories, and keeps track of our body's exact location. But to do this last part, the superior parietal lobe must also produce a boundary line, the border of self, the division between finite, us, and the infinite, not us, that is the rest of the universe. Obviously, drawing this border is no simple task, so the OAA depends on a constant stream of incoming messages. All of our senses send data to the OAA. Incredible calculations occur, but all of this takes a lot of energy. When that energy is needed elsewhere, like during moments of intense focus, the OAA stops performing those calculations because it stops receiving those data signals. Without this data stream, this part of the brain is temporarily blinded. It too becomes hypofrontal, and to incredible result. Once this happens, says Newberg, we can no longer draw a line and say this is where the self ends, and this is where the rest of the world begins. So the brain concludes, it has to conclude, that at this moment you are one with everything. This is a somewhat startling reversal. Ever since Aldous Huxley told the world about his experiment with mescaline, the idea has been that the doors of perception needed to be opened for cosmic unity to be revealed. Newberg and De Aquili discovered the inverse. With hypofrontality, attention is narrowing. Parts of the brain are shutting down. Oneness is the result of the narrowing of the doors of perception, not throwing them wide open. Newberg and De Aquili also discovered that what you focus on matters. Surfers, with their attention entirely on a wave, become one with the wave. Meditating Franciscan nuns had God's love in mind, so their experience was oneness with God's love. There's little difference between the type of concentration a meditator needs to achieve ecstasy and the type required by a surfer dropping into a big wave. Focus is focus. The problem is fear, which stands between us and all actions. Yet our fears are grounded in self and time. With our sense of self out of the way, we are liberated from doubt and insecurity. With time gone, there is no yesterday to regret or tomorrow to worry about. And when our sense of space disappears, so do physical consequences. But when they vanish all at once, something far more incredible occurs. Our fear of death, the most fundamental of all fears, can no longer exist. Simply put, if you are infinite and atemporal, you cannot die. This is another reason why flow states significantly enhance performance. When the self disappears, it takes many of our limits along for the ride. Chapter 7. The Autotelic Experience. Everything we've described here, the loss of self, time, and space, are not the most ordinary of experiences. When people bump into these phenomena, it's a rare encounter. This is also why William James described the state as mystical, and Abraham Maslow borrowed quasi-Buddhist terms like self-actualization for its long-term effect. Or as basketball legend Bill Russell explains in his biography Second Wind, you really do feel psychic. Here's Bill Russell explaining the transcendent experience. Every so often, a Celtic game would heat up, so that it became more than a physical or even mental game, and would be magical. That feeling is difficult to describe, and I certainly never talked about it when I was playing. When it happened, I could feel my play rise to a new level. The feeling would spread to the other guys, and we'd all levitate. And then the game would just take off, and there'd be a natural ebb and flow that reminded you of how rhythmic and musical basketball is supposed to be. I'd find myself thinking, this is it. I want this to keep going. And I'd actually be rooting for the other team. When their players made spectacular moves, I wanted their shots to go in the bucket. That's how pumped up I'd be. I'd be out there talking to the other Celtics, encouraging them, and pushing myself harder. But at the same time, part of me would be pulling for the other players too. At that special level, all sorts of odd things happen. It was almost as if we were playing in slow motion. I could almost sense how the next play would develop during those spells, and where the next shot would be taken, even before the other team brought the ball in bounds. I could feel it so keenly that I'd want to shout to my teammates, "It's coming there," except that I knew everything would change if I did. My premonitions would be consistently correct, and I always felt then that I not only knew all the Celtics by heart, but also all the opposing players. There have been many times in my career when I felt moved or joyful, but these were the moments when I had chills pulsing up and down my spine. The game would be in a white heat of competition, and yet somehow, I wouldn't feel competitive, which is a miracle in itself. I'd be putting out the maximum effort, straining, coughing up parts of my lungs as we ran, and yet, I never felt the pain. On the occasions when the game ended at that special level, I literally didn't care who had won. If we lost, I'd still be as free and as high as a skyhawk. But I had to be quiet about it. At times, I'd hint around to the other players about this feeling, but I never talked about it much, least of all to the other Celtics. I felt a little weird about it and quite private. Besides, I couldn't let on to my teammates that it was ever all right to lose. I had too much of an influence on the team. We were the Celtics, and our reason for being was to win championships. So I had to keep those private feelings to myself. As the book evolves, I will gradually lay out the methodology for triggering such a state. Once you begin applying the triggers described in Part 4 of the book, you'll immediately start producing more flow in your life. But you need to know that the flow path, just like any path, has its struggles and pitfalls. Committing to this path demands a considerable tolerance for risk and a considerable shift of our mindset. It's a job to continuously find flow, says Mike Horn, arguably the greatest living adventurer. You have to train your body to prepare for the state. You have to train your mind to prepare for the state. You have to know yourself and your limits. Know exactly what you're afraid of, and how hard to push past it. That's serious work. Therefore, Part 3 of the book will provide you with a mindset that guides you through these struggles and pitfalls. But get it right, Mike Horn continues, and not only does it become easier to find flow once, it becomes easier to find it again and again. Part 3. The Growth Mindset and the Flow Cycle. Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up. Batman Begins. Chapter 8. Mindset. Almost everything I've covered so far in the book falls under the category of what happens when we begin to find flow with regularity. But the state is unpredictable and not guaranteed. The kind of mindset we have to deal with this insecurity and unease is crucial in our ability to tap into flow. When confronted with the struggle phase of the state and not having the right mindsets, we tend to reach for a pill or another retreat rather than get down to hard work. The idea being, if it was all so easy, clear, and effortless in flow, then why not wait for the next wave to hit? We don't have to look far for examples. Think of any hippie holdover community or almost every surf or ski town in the world. Not being in flow becomes an excuse to stay listless and undermotivated, and literally waiting for the next wave to hit. How every decision, every action, leads seamlessly to the next, lays a different kind of trap. When we think of flow, we only think of the magical ease accompanied by the state. But the feel-good flow experience is just one step in a 4-part flow cycle. It's impossible to experience flow without moving through this entire cycle. And again, this needs a mindset that can handle this transitory nature of the state. In a slightly different tone, society likes to pay for performance. When we watch a live concert or a traditional sports event, says the former head of innovation at Yahoo, Salim Ismail, we're essentially paying to watch people in a flow state, whether it's Roger Federer, Jay-Z, or a jazz crooner. They've all put in endless hours of work so that when performance time comes, they are fully present and in flow. An actor with a screen presence is there too. A great poet can deliver flow to the reader, just through the power of words. We pay to watch, read, or be in the presence of a flow experience. We need to recognize that in the process of finding that light switch to our lives, we are often confronted with despair and struggle. And as Rollo May says, a man or woman becomes fully human only by his or her choices and his or her commitment to them. People attain worth and dignity by the multitude of decisions they make from day to day. These decisions require courage. But we need more. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. This attitude is what Carol Dweck, the world's leading authority on the science of motivation, calls the growth mindset. She tells us, when we read and learn about the brain and how it changes in response to challenges, we are much more likely to persevere when we fail, because we don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. And that's precisely the work that stands before us. The growth mindset. In the middle 2000s, psychologist Carol Dweck got to know race car driver coach Ross Bentley, who is considered one of the best racing instructors. Bentley built his career around mental preparedness. He believed that winning was all about flow, but the nature of the sport made this especially difficult. With races lasting for hours, errors are inevitable. The key is being able to make a mistake and not let it ruin concentration. Faster drivers are those who can stay in the zone no matter what, explained Bentley. Carol Dweck, a researcher at Stanford University who had spent 30 years studying motivation, and Ross Bentley, who pulls from his 30 years of experience in training top drivers, suspected mindset played a huge role in this ability. After more than 30 years of research, Carol Dweck found that most of us have one of two basic mindsets. Those who have fixed mindsets believe abilities like intelligence and athletic talent are innate and unchangeable, i.e., fixed at birth. Those with growth mindsets believe abilities are gained through dedication and hard work, that natural-born talent is merely starting points for a much longer learning process. When Tom Schaar was capable of doing the impossible, and he got curious to find out what else was possible, that's having a growth mindset. And it's the same mindset that Dweck suspected was responsible for the flow states of winning race car drivers. In 2007, to see if their suspicions were correct, Dweck and Bentley recruited 40 top drivers, then tested them on mindset before, during, and after every race of the season. The results were significant. They found that drivers with growth mindsets could enter flow more quickly and stay there no matter what went wrong during the race. Across the board, they were the winning drivers. Why? The short answer is that a growth mindset is one of the secrets to maximizing the total amount of flow in your life. The long answer brings us to the challenge skill ratio, the first of the flow conditions, and arguably the most important one. Chapter 9. The Slippery Challenge Skill Beam. Flow occurs at the edge of our ability, the spot where the task is hard enough to make us stretch, but not hard enough to make us snap, in what scientists call the flow channel. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi introduced this handy graph to illustrate when flow state occurs. To achieve a state of flow, you'll need to operate on a fine line between challenge and skill level. The idea behind this ratio is that attention is most engaged, i.e., in the now, when there's a very specific relationship between the difficulty of a task and our ability to perform that task. If the challenge is too great, fear swamps the system. If the challenge is too easy, we stop paying attention. This sweet spot is the end result of what is also known as the Yerkes-Dodson law, the fact that increased stress leads to increased performance up to a certain point. But if the stress continues after that point, the stress hormones become counterproductive or even damage your health. How far is that sweet spot outside our comfort zone of current abilities? Answers vary, but the general thinking is about 4%. That's it. That's the sweet spot. If you want to trigger flow, the challenge should be 4% greater than the skills, not 40%, not 400%, and definitely not 4,000%. The problem is that people are terrible at estimating their abilities. Says Dweck. Recently, we set out to see who was most likely to do this. Sure, we found that people greatly misestimated their performance and their ability, but it was those with the fixed mindset who accounted for almost all the inaccuracy. To find 4%, you need accurate self-knowledge, and this is tricky for fixed mindsetters. When you think about it, Dweck writes in her book, Mindset, this makes sense. If, like those with growth mindset, you believe you can develop yourself, then you're open to accurate information about your current abilities, even if it's unflattering. What's more, if you're oriented toward learning, you need accurate information about your current abilities in order to learn effectively. However, if everything is either good news or bad news, as it is with fixed mindset people, distortion almost inevitably enters the picture. Some outcomes are magnified, others are explained away. And before you know it, you don't know yourself at all. Here is where adventure and sport athletes have another advantage to tap into the state. In big waves, a degree of difficulty can mean the difference between home for dinner and never home again. Under these conditions, the desire for improvements comes from understepping, and the need for survival from overstepping. This also means they need to have great self-knowledge. If they consistently overestimate or underestimate their abilities, tuning that ratio is like playing Russian roulette. We often blow behind 4% without even noticing it in our day-to-day life, and also not without consequences. Just to name a few: anxiety, fearfulness, anger, frustration, a block on creativity. Or what about the physical symptoms such as headaches, backaches, or insomnia? In conclusion, we can say that the absence of self-knowledge makes it harder to tune the challenge skill ratio. Equally vexing, if the resulting feedback is unflattering, fixed mindsetters tend to distort the bad news, making it even tougher to remain dialed in. A growth mindset moves us in the other direction. Self-knowledge accumulates over time, and finding flow becomes less a quest, more a habit. In other words, a growth mindset not only helps create more flow in the moment, it helps create more flow over the long haul. And when it comes to flow, the haul is far longer than most suppose. Case Study 3. The Impossible in Chess. Josh Waitzkin is a peak performance polymath. He started out as the real-life version of the child chess prodigy portrayed in the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, earning the title International Chess Master before 16. Next, he ventured into martial arts, becoming a world champion in Tai Chi and then turning his attention to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, earning a black belt under legendary fighter Marcelo Garcia. Afterward, he became a writer, publishing The Art of Learning, which has since become a high-performance classic. This makes Waitzkin a great exemplar and a great case study for our quest to understand the state. Here's Waitzkin sharing his flow experience. Here I was, in a strange, faraway land, sweating in the oppressive heat, trying to find my beloved art in the figurines in front of me. Above me, thousands of spectators hung from the rafters, whispering, staring at the chessboard like sutra. Somehow, chess and India resonate like ancient lovers. I was disjointed, out of whack, not yet settled into the rhythm of the tournament. Even for the master, sometimes chess can feel like home, and sometimes it can be completely alienating, a foreign jungle that must be explored as if for the first time. Across from me was the Indian national champion. In between the two of us lay the critical position of our struggle. We were 3 hours into the battle, and I had been thinking for 20 minutes. A curious thing happened at that time. So far, I've been grinding my way through this game. It was the first round. I had no flow, no inspired ideas. The pieces were alien. The position, strange. I was trying to find my way home. Then, there was an earthquake. Everything started to shake and the lights went out. The rafters exploded with noise, and people ran out of the building. I sat still. I knew what was happening, but I experienced it from within the chess position. I was in the zone. First, you're a person looking at a chessboard. You calculate through the various alternatives, the mind gaining speed as it pours through the complexities, until consciousness of one's separation from the positions ebbs away. And what remains is the sensation of being inside the energetic chess flow. Then the mind moves with the speed of an electrical current. Complex problems are breezed through with intuitive clarity. You get deeper and deeper into the soul of a chess position. Time falls away. The concept of I is gone. All that exists is blissful engagement, pure presence, absolute flow. There was a surreal synergy of me and no me, pure thought and the awareness of a thinker. It wasn't me looking at the chess position, but I was aware of myself and the shaking world from within the serenity of pure engagement. And I solved the chess problem. Somehow the earthquake and the dying lights spurred me to revelation. I had crystallization of thought, resurfaced, and vacated the trembling playing room. When I returned and play resumed, I immediately made my move and went on to win the game. Chapter 10. The Flow Cycle. By now, it should not come as a surprise that Waitzkin found himself in a flow state, but he first moved through what Herbert Benson, the Harvard cardiologist, describes a series of distinct, identifiable stages. In our words, the flow cycle. This brings us to a fundamental misconception around the state, namely that the state works like a light switch, on or off. You're either in the zone or you're not. Scientists describe the nature of the flow state as transient or unsteady. In our words, the state is just one stage in a 4-part flow cycle. The first stage begins with a hard mental or physical struggle. The second stage, which directly follows the struggle stage, has been described as letting go, or releasing tension. The third stage is the flow state itself. And the fourth and final stage in the cycle is recovery, or as Benson calls it, returning to a new normal. The following graph is helpful to visualize these four stages. But as you perceive it, remember this: flow arises from highly complex neurological, biochemical, and physiologic interactions, and cannot be captured into two-dimensional diagrams, or even in technical language. It would be like trying to capture lightning in a bottle. But despite these limitations, the picture should provide you with a better understanding of the flow cycle. The better you can understand this cycle, the better you can move through it efficiently and delicately. The cycle can be found in any field of endeavor, from business to scientific research, to religious discipline to sports. Specific biological and neurochemical responses will accompany these stages, as we are about to see. For example, in the struggle phase, this may include increased blood pressure, heart rate, and brain activity like the release of cortisol and norepinephrine. In contrast, during the release phase, nitric oxide is being released, which causes the mind and body to quiet down and to open a way for a flow experience. The flow phase itself causes dopamine, endorphins, and anandamide to flow into the system. And the recovery phase is accompanied by the release of serotonin, oxytocin, and allows the body and mind to deeply recover. Let's dive deeper into the different stages of the flow cycle. The struggle phase. Even though flow is always a positive experience, it starts with an unpleasant phase called struggle. Herbert Benson, who did much of the fundamental research on this cycle, chose the name for a reason. Struggle is a loading phase, writes Benson in his book The Breakout Principle. We are overloading the brain with information. Furthermore, there are two types of struggle. One, struggle that begins voluntarily with an act of will. Two, a struggle that is imposed involuntarily, usually by outside events. In the second situation, you don't have a choice whether to deal with a problem, such as in the case of the loss of a job, family tragedy, divorce, spiritual crisis, community disaster, and other circumstances as a result of external events. Both situations can potentially bring a person into a flow experience. But, as this falls out of the scope of this book, I'll continue with the struggle with an act of will. The voluntary struggle phase usually comes from extensive preparation, intense training, or complex problems at work, and other circumstances that will put you under stress. For a business person, Benson tells us, this may be concentrated problem analysis or fact gathering. The serious athlete may engage in extensive and demanding physical training. The person on a spiritual quest may plunge into a concentrated study or intense prayer or meditation. Regardless of how the process begins, significant stress will be involved in the early stages. In struggle, profound chemical changes occur. Stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, and norepinephrine are pumped into the system. Tension rises and frustration as well. Our problem seems unsolvable, our effort unsustainable, and the whole situation feels as far from flow as one could get. Emotionally, we feel the adrenaline as fear. It's the fight or flight or freeze response. How we handle these negative feelings is critical. Either you embrace the struggle, which equals flow in the long run, or resist the obstacle by quitting. Until that happens, we feel stressed and uncomfortable. To move through struggle takes a leap of faith and a belief that the stress will help you enhance your performance. By definition, this demands a growth mindset. Take a moment to look at the two mindsets below and consider which set of statements you agree with more strongly. Mindset 1. Stress is harmful. Experiencing stress depletes my health and vitality. Experiencing stress debilitates my performance and productivity. Experiencing stress inhibits my learning and growth. The effects of stress are negative and should be avoided. Mindset 2. Stress is enhancing. Experiencing stress enhances my performance and productivity. Experiencing stress improves my health and vitality. Experiencing stress facilitates my learning and growth. The effects of stress are positive and should be utilized. Of these two mindsets, stress is harmful is by far the most common. says psychologist Kelly McGonigal in her book The Upside of Stress. While most people can see some truth in both mindsets, they still view stress as more harmful than helpful. If you're like most people, it's the stress is harmful mindset. This is rooted in what researchers call the mismatch theory, the mindset that our evolutionary adaptive fight or flight response was helpful when we were evading saber-toothed tigers. But this doesn't have a place in our modern society. Helping you shift your mindset to see how stress can enhance your performance is, of course, the essence of this part of the book. If we go back to Waitzkin's story, we see how the battle to stay focused and pressure of the world championship brought him into struggle. All our psychological war, recalls Waitzkin. We were 3 hours into battle, and I had been thinking for 20 minutes. I had been grinding my way through this game. It was the first round. I had no flow, no inspired ideas. The pieces were alien, the position strange. Of course, even if a player has logged in extensive hours of practice, he or she may still have a bad game. But the struggle phase will put the players in a much stronger position to experience the flow state, as the experience of Waitzkin demonstrates. But to move out of struggle and into flow, you must first pass through the second phase. Release phase. Release means to take your mind off the problem, and this is a crucial part in the flow cycle. Why? Remember the Yerkes-Dodson law? Stress must increase to a certain point if you hope to achieve your optimal performance. But after that certain point, the stress hormones become counterproductive and even harmful. Or, as Benson says it, when you've wrung the maximum benefit from the good stress that your body has generated, you must escape the influx of bad stress. Otherwise, the overflow of norepinephrine and other fight-or-flight hormones will drag you down into mediocre performance and perhaps damage your health. To further facilitate our discussion on the flow cycle, I've revised the flow cycle diagram so you can easily see the role they're releasing. To get into flow, you'll need to make your escape from the downward spiral. This may raise a couple concerns. For starters, how can we tell when we've reached the top of the Yerkes-Dodson bell curve, where the stress has begun to work against us? An effective subject test, Benson tells us, is an inner shift from feeling a good edge and forward momentum in your work or thinking to sensing that the pressure is beginning to work against you. Warning signs may include excessive anxiety or fearfulness, anger, a tendency to cry, frustration, a block on creativity, or physical symptoms such as headaches or backaches. Okay, that's clear, but how do we make our escape from the destructive stress? Nothing spectacular here. If you've been cramming for a test or deadline, soak in a tub or listen to your favorite music. If you're a nature lover, walk in the woods or wander at the seashore. If you've been trying to master double-back diamond ski slopes, take a few runs down the blues. If the innovation team has been pulling all-nighters, send them out for dinner and a movie. The method is unimportant. The message is release tension, or, as Benson describes, completely sever prior thought and emotional patterns. How long should the releasing phase be to be effective? The release phase's duration varies and depends on the intensity of the struggle, but the general thinking is about 10 minutes and preferably 20 minutes. But if getting focused is hit or miss, how can we give up our focus when we finally got it? My answers are to redefine the questions. Not only do we have to learn to let go of our concentration, but we also have to be really good at it. Conditioning to the insecurity starts young. As children, we might be told to concentrate by parents and teachers, and then be corrected if we look off into the clouds. So the child in us learned to associate not focusing with being bad. The result is that we concentrate with everything we've got until we can't withstand the pressure and have a meltdown. I sometimes blew myself out with intensity during a game, recalls Waitzkin. In my early scholastic days, chess tournaments were long and exhaustive, but my dad and I were very good at preserving my energy. Most of my young rivals had coaches who treated tournaments like a military camp. Teachers and parents would make kids analyze their game extensively between rounds, trying to wring a chess lesson out of every moment, while I would be outside having a catch with my dad or taking a nap, Maybe it's no accident that I tend to surge at the end of tournaments. My pops is a clever guy. And his dad had it all right. As it turns out, researchers discovered that the key to expanding capacity and pushing beyond one's ordinary limits is to seek short moments of recovery. This is what researchers describe as rhythmic wave oscillation. And as we're about to see, it represents the fundamentals of long-term success and fulfillment. Let's look at the science of stress and release and how we can benefit from it. Stress and release. In the previous chapter, I told the importance of the releasing phase within Benson's flow cycle framework. Now I'd like to briefly discuss it from the perspective of performance psychologists Jim Laird and Tony Schwartz, who ran a performance training center called the Human Performance Institute, HPI. At HPI, they discovered a clear psychological connection when it comes to the ability to release tension and recover from mental exhaustion. By the time I first went down to HPI, recalls Waitzkin, it was already becoming a mecca for athletes who wanted to hone their performance. I remember it clearly. After a few hours of conversation in which I described my life, career, and current issue, Laird sat back and asked me whether or not I believed the quality of a chess thought process was higher if it was preceded by a period of relaxation. This simple question led to a revolution in my approach to peak performance. That evening, after a long day of eye-opening sessions with Jim Laird, I sat down with my laptop and chess notebooks and spent a few hours looking over my previous year of competitions. It led to the discovery of a very interesting pattern. Looking back over my games, I saw that I had 2 to 10 minute crisp thoughts when I had been playing well. When I was off my game, I would sometimes fall into a deep calculation that lasted over 20 minutes. And this long thinking often led to inaccuracy. What is more, if I had a number of long thoughts in a row, the quality of my decisions tended to deteriorate. Our energy and recovery are our most fundamental need to perform well. Therefore, it's crucial to live like a sprinter. Break life down into a series of manageable intervals consistent with our psychological needs, with a periodic rhythm of stress and recovery. This is what Jim Laird and Tony Schwartz describe in their book The Power of Full Engagement as the time between points. As for performance psychologists, their goal was to understand the factors that set apart the greatest competitors in the world from the rest of the pack. Laird spent hundreds of hours watching top players and studying tapes of their matches. He could detect almost no significant differences in their competitive habits during points to his growing frustration. It was only when he noticed what they did between points that he suddenly saw a difference. While most of them were not aware of it, the best players had each built almost precisely the same set of routines between points. These included the way they walked back to the baseline after a point, how they held their heads and shoulders, where they focused their eyes, the pattern of their breathing, and even the way they talked to themselves. The psychologists discovered that the players who can relax in brief moments of inactivity are almost always the ones who end up coming through when the game is on the line. Remember Michael Jordan sitting on the bench, a towel on his shoulders, letting it all go for a 2-minute break before coming back in the game? Jordan was utterly serene on the bench, even though the Bulls desperately needed him on the court. He didn't even watch the other team's offensive strategies. The more he could let things go, the sharper he was in the next set. Imagine a tennis match going from the first set to the second, to the third to the fourth, and perhaps to the fifth. If I'm playing against you, and I can squeeze in 20 seconds of rest after an intense burst of activity dozens and dozens of times, while you can't, who do you think will be sharper at the end of the match, and therefore, of course, more likely to win consistently? Easy answer, of course, the one who knows how to oscillate. Same with our day-to-day life. These realizations are a good starting point, but how do we learn to let go on the free throw line in overtime of the NBA playoffs, or in the moments before making a career-defining presentation? This is where the body and mind connection sets in. But first, let me share a personal reflection with you. A personal reflection. Surfing has always been an excellent ground for my rejuvenation and mental game. Floating on the water requires constant presence and the release of control. A surfboard is constantly moving with the sea, lurching beneath the body, and the only way to catch a wave is to sink into the rhythm of the wave and be ready for anything. At sea, I learned that virtually all situations can be handled as long as presence of mind is maintained. At the same time, it's easy to lose your calm when a 10-foot wave comes at you at 15 miles per hour, or when caught in the not-so-sexy impact zone. The impact zone is where my mental game snaps and brings me into struggle. I sometimes panic and make terrible decisions. I reach out too quickly for my board, get hit again sideways, or struggle to climb on top just as another wave crashes through, and getting caught between sets. Any poor decision in such a moment makes the impact zone experience even worse because it lasts longer, pushes you to the brink of your stamina, and sometimes breath capacity. When washed by the waves, you can only inhale when your face is not submerged underwater. Therefore, in surfing, it's increasingly important to learn when it's best to breathe and how to maximize your air intake. In those moments, I was forced to use my breath wisely, which brought me back to the now. Now, I make sure when I'm surfing, I maintain a calm inhale-exhale pattern, keeping it steady and rhythmic. Many surfers who are unsure of themselves in the water tend to panic slightly, even if they don't realize it, and alter their breathing patterns, hyperventilating themselves into exhaustion. Fail to navigate the impact zone in your vulnerable self, and you're washed by the sea. But if you strategize correctly and make the right moves that the moment calls for, you're safe and ready to ride the next wave. In fact, some of the best waves I caught were while recovering from getting smacked. The key here is a short, quick recovery. It turns a mess into a sleek performance. But the impact zone isn't just out there in the water. Sometimes, life just hits me, especially when I'm riding my dreams and my careers, relationships, and of course, out in the lineup. This requires that we learn to navigate through some challenging waters. Because if I'm not out there paddling, I'm on the shore watching, a bystander. And that's never where the action is. So, let's return to those strategies, because they're life-saving, energy-conserving, and smart to employ as much in surfing or any other sports. The mind-body connection. I've already mentioned the clear psychological connection between the ability to release tension and recover from mental exhaustion. What is more, physical flushing and mental clarity are very much intertwined. To be more precise, performance psychologists tell us that interval work is a critical building block to becoming a consistent long-term performer. So, suppose you spend a few months practicing stress and release in the physical area of your life. In that case, you'll lay the psychological foundation for releasing tension and better gateways to flow. Let's say you enjoy swimming laps in a pool. Instead of just swimming until you're exhausted and then quitting, push yourself to your healthy limit. Recover for a minute or two, then push yourself again. Create a rhythm of intervals and watch your breathing, like I described with surfing. With practice, increase the intensity and duration of your sprint time and gradually condense rest periods. This same pattern can be used with weightlifting. If you're doing 3 sets of 15 repetitions of a bench press, leave 45 seconds between sets, where you completely set your attention on your recovery by following your breath. Over time, you can increase the intensity and duration of the sets. For example, if you're doing 3 sets of 12 repetitions with heavier weights, you could do 50 seconds rest between the sets. And if lifting heavy weights, do 3 sets of 8 repetitions and take 1 minute rest between sets. The same patterns can be used for jogging, push-ups, sprinting, or any activity involving cardiovascular work. This will help connect your interval training to your mental arenas. The idea is to integrate certain stress and recovery patterns into our day-to-day life to be entirely natural for you when the struggle is on. And as we get better and better at releasing tension and coming back with a full tank of gas, both physical and mental, we will gain confidence in our abilities to move back and forth between concentration, adrenaline flow, physical exertion, any kind of stress, and relaxation. So, in conclusion, struggle gives way to release. Releases give way to flow. Hallelujah. But before we enter the next stage, give it a try right now. If you are reading these pages with a lot of tension, put the book down, take some deep breaths, and pick it up again with a fresh eye. Even better, make it a habit to do some physical exercises in the time between the points, such as push-ups, and try to focus on your breathing to lower your heart rate. Now that your conscious mind is free to take little breaks, you'll be delighted by the surges of creativity that will emerge out of your unconscious mind. You'll become more attuned to your intuition, and will slowly become more and more true to your own creative expression. The unconscious mind is a powerful tool, and learning how to relax under pressure is a key first step to tapping into its potential. Flow phase. Now we've arrived at the third stage in the cycle, the flow state itself. Since we already know what flow is, we will turn our attention to what prevents us from stepping into the state. Flow blockers is the term we're using. Let's have a quick look at those flow blockers. Negative self-talk. Negative self-talk can be a hard habit to beat. The process is like changing a bad technical habit in a sport. You need to identify the problem behavior, learn a more appropriate behavior, and practice this positive skill often to retrain the body to respond as you want it to. So the next time you'll be practicing your sport, pay attention to what you say to yourself throughout the day. Whenever you think about yourself, pay close attention to what you think about yourself. This exercise is not about eliminating the inner critic. It's about self-awareness. You will have an idea of how frequently you use self-talk and whether it's working for or against you. If you found you had lots of negative statements, see if you can come up with a positive statement. When you find yourself in a situation similar to one in which your self-talk has been negative, try saying the positive alternative instead. The ultimate goal with the skill of controlling your self-talk is to have it work automatically, every time you need it. This is the true test of mental skills. When you're under pressure, do your thoughts turn against you? Or do they come to your aid? Learning to speak to yourself in a positive way is another useful skill for improving confidence. Not optimal energy level. If an athlete knows she has not done the necessary training to be in good shape for an event, flow is unlikely to occur. On the other hand, being fatigued from too heavy training load is also recognized as a factor preventing flow. Finding a balance between too much and too little training is essential for both athletes and coaches. In addition, flow may not be equally easy to achieve through all the stages of a season, especially when training is periodized, due to the workloads that athletes carry when heavy conditioning is required and injury. The best way to cope with possible future setbacks is to make backup plans. You can plan for a potential repeat of situations and for new potential situations that may occur in the future. Knowing you have a backup strategy will boost your self-confidence and allow you to focus on the present moment. Lack of preparation. Sometimes athletes are well prepared physically, but fail in other aspects of pre-competitive preparation. What they do immediately before competition might be poorly organized, or they might not have set aside enough time to be mentally ready for the event ahead. Being unprepared can be a big stumbling block. Pre-competition preparations are important flow facilitators. Having a routine and following it is a great way to ensure mental readiness. Athletes vary in how they like to get ready for competition. For instance, some athletes feel more relaxed when they are alone before competition and focus inwardly. Although one sometimes cannot be isolated physically, it's still possible before an event to focus inwardly by, for example, focusing on the inhale and exhale of the breath. The more a pre-competition plan is rehearsed, the more automatic it will become. As a result, less analysis and planning will be required during the actual performance. Now, there is something you need to know before moving on to our final stage. The duration of a flow state varies from task to task. The same goes for intensity. For example, a flow state triggered by a 20-minute meditation session won't need the same recovery as a flow experience triggered by surfing, a soccer match, or a golf tournament. But in general, we can say that flow is an extremely expensive state for the body to produce and maintain. It requires a lot of energy and a lot of neurochemistry, and both take a little while to restore. And that brings us to the fourth and final stage of flow. Recovery phase. Just like struggle, recovery is another cycle step that doesn't feel flowy. Handling the massive delta between the world at your feet sensation that comes with flow and the utterly ordinary, all too human reality that shows up afterward is not always pleasant. There's no more feel-good neurochemistry, no more superhuman powers, and it can take a considerable amount of resilience to navigate recovery. Here too, a growth mindset makes a difference. After experiencing flow, the person with a fixed mindset wants to take a unilateral credit for the amazing performance that came with that state. That's the basis of their self-esteem. If I can do that, then I must be that all the time. But we know by now that flow is a transitory state. So, when it leaves, the same person who took all of the credit for its presence is left with all the blame for its absence. For someone with a fixed mindset, that's often too much to tolerate. At the expense of health and relationships, they start seeking that high all the time, or self-handicap their performance with substance abuse, overtraining, and reckless decisions. And for fixed mindsetters, this isn't where problems end. To find flow again, the entire cycle needs to restart. This means moving from recovery back into struggle. But if you're stressed out from not being in flow during recovery, then getting fired up for serious frustration of struggle becomes a much more challenging task. This is where action and adventure athletes have another advantage, writes Kotler in The Rise of Superman. Recovery comes built in. Most of these sports are weather dependent. A big wave surfer needs big waves. Snowboarders prefer deep powder. Kayakers want specific wave levels to run rivers. These epic conditions do not show up every day. In their world, when the big storm blows in, everyone takes advantage. Then the storm passes, and it's time to relax. This built-in lag time creates space for rejuvenation. It allows athletes to build up reserves during recovery and prepare for the next round of struggle. This doesn't happen much anymore in sport competition. Rarely do we give ourselves permission to recover. In fact, in most of our lives, the reward for having a high-flow experience and pulling off something challenging in our sports is usually more intense training and less time to recover. At a high level, Waitzkin says, the chess world has many big games, and in long, grueling tournaments, they tend to follow one another, over and over, for days and weeks at a time. I know how to block out my issues in a sprint, but I run out of gas in marathons. Consistency became a critical problem. One day, I was inspired. I was unstoppable. But other days, I would play bad chess. It was time that Waitzkin learned the science of long-term peak performance. Managing energy. Our physical energy is the fundamental source of all other energies. Our physical energy comes from an interaction between energy expenditure and energy renewal. Both depend on our sleep and breathing patterns, and quality of our recovery. Let's discuss some recovery strategies. The main choices are passive and active. Passive recovery is scrolling on the phone or watching Netflix on the couch. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, screen time disrupts the single most important source of recovery: sleep. This is because passive recovery keeps the brain active in an unusual way. For example, watching TV shuts down your higher cortical centers, which is usually good for recovery. But the constantly shifting images overstimulate the visual system, pulling the brain right out of alpha wave and into beta wave, which is the brainwave signature of awake and alert, as you might recall from part 1 of the book. Active recovery is the opposite. It ensures that the brain stays off and the body can rest. And equally important, it flushes stress hormones from the system by shifting from beta waves into alpha waves first, then delta waves. So, active recovery practices allow us to really reset. Research shows you can get really good at recovery in 3 simple steps. First, protect your sleep. Deep delta wave sleep is critical for recovery. It's when repair of the muscles occur. You need a dark room, cold temperatures, no screen time 1 to 2 hours before bedtime, and stop eating at least 3 hours before bed. Second, put an active recovery protocol into place, such as restorative yoga, stretching, long baths, or long walks in the woods. These are all traditional methods for active recovery. It is important that athletes experiment to identify the recovery options that work best for each individual. 2 to 3 days of active recovery can save an athlete 1 or 2 months of injury frustration in the long term. The third step is the total reset. Don't underestimate this step, especially if you're an athlete competing in competition. At the end of the season, take 2 to 4 weeks of almost complete rest. But it's important to stay active during that time. For example, if you're a soccer player, you need to recover from serious hits of the lower body, such as the ankle and knee. This gives a good opportunity to train your upper body, or enjoy other activities, like surfing or swimming. But there's no purpose in that activity, except for having fun. We had a look at the way of flow within the framework of Benson's flow cycle, and how mindset plays a huge role in tapping into the state. This is all accompanied by examples of sport athletes who have repeatedly used the state to accelerate performance. But between them and us, there are still a couple of milestones we need to cover. Therefore, in part 4 of this book, we'll dive deeper into the necessary conditions of flow, circumstances that create our entrance into the state. Flow triggers is the term we'll be using to describe these circumstances. Part 4. Getting into flow. The conditions of flow. As children, we are taught not to play with fire, not how to play with fire. Stephen Kotler. Chapter 11. Internal flow triggers. Flow state is universal, showing up in anyone, provided certain initial conditions are met. Originally, Csikszentmihalyi called these conditions proximal conditions for flow, but this has since been shortened to flow triggers, preconditions that lead to flow. Researchers identified 22 different flow triggers. There are probably more. Yet they all share one thing in common. Flow follows focus. The state can only arise when all of our attention is directed at the present moment. So, that's what precisely all these triggers do. They drive attention into the now in one of two ways. 1, they push dopamine and norepinephrine into our system. And 2, they lower cognitive load. The lowering of cognitive load is the psychological weight of all the stuff we're thinking about at any moment in time. By lowering the cognitive load, we're liberating energy, which the brain can then repurpose for paying attention to the task at hand. Let me illustrate this with one of the flow triggers we're already familiar with. The challenge-skill ratio. Flow occurs at the edge of our ability, the spot where the task is hard enough to make us stretch, but not hard enough to make us snap. To achieve a state of flow, you'll need to operate on a fine line between challenge and skill level. The idea is relatively straightforward. Flow follows focus, and we pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. Think challenging, yet manageable. Just enough stimulation to shortcut attention into the now, not too much stress to pull you back out again. When we are pushing past our limits, talents, and advancing our abilities, the brain rewards this effort with dopamine. And because dopamine enhances focus even more, this increases our chances of getting into flow. I love mountain biking. The challenge of learning and improving is precisely what draws me to highly skilled activities, like mountain biking. The moment I drop into the track, I immediately feel the sensation of dopamine and norepinephrine spiking up. While I might not be in flow, enough of my attention is focused on the task at hand, biking, to be moving me in the right direction. To push myself into flow, what I need to do is something that drives me into my challenge skill sweet spot. I could amp up my speed, or I could find that steep track with cheeky corners that, on my last trip through, required some serious turns and bumps on my way down. By doing either, I've upped the challenge level a little bit, and my brain rewards that risk-taking effort with even more dopamine. Suddenly, there's enough neurochemistry in my system to push me into flow. Once in flow, it isn't just my mind paying more attention. Suddenly, my entire body is paying attention. Still, there is tension and threat, but there are no words, no mind, no distractions. All the track features speak to me, and I to them with motion. There is joy and release and an overall deep sense of deep embodiment. I am literally flowing with part of the flow of the world. The sweet spot for flow is when the challenge just exceeds our ability. An elite athlete will find the challenge skill balance in a World Cup finale. A basketball player can allow himself to shoot only from behind the three-point line. A soccer player may challenge himself to win every second ball. A musician may challenge herself to play for an audience. Challenge is an important component of flow, but It is the interconnection of challenge with skill, along with the expression of other flow conditions, that creates this optimal experience. Immediate feedback. It would be impossible to participate in any sport if one didn't know, moment by moment, how things are going. A tennis player sees where her shots were landing, or a skier sees whether she was on or off the trail. Immediate feedback is critical to successful performance, and athletes who are tuned into the feedback loop given by their own movement and bodies, as well as by external cues in the environment, are able to tap into flow. One of the advantages of sport is the number of potential sources of feedback it can provide. The coaching staff is able to give advice during breaks, spectators provide feedback by applauding. The body itself provides probably the most important feedback, though. For example, a swimmer knows by the feel of the arms and body through the water whether he's creating a smooth stroke, or, alternatively, too much drag. A tennis player knows when she swings the racket whether her positioning is correct or needs adjusting. Feedback is neither good nor bad in itself. It is simply information that can be used to monitor and adjust performance as needed. The importance here is that the focus must be on immediate feedback, not just feedback. The definition of immediate refers to a direct, in-the-moment coupling between cause and effect. The smaller the gap between cause and effect, the more we know how we're doing, and how to steer when we're off course. The athlete who focuses on the scoreboard or time board that tells how close he is to winning or losing can be easily distracted and lose his presence. But a runner who checks his time every mile and makes any necessary adjustments is likely to get into flow. Learning to use feedback to your advantage is a critical part for creating flow, especially if you're able to use this feedback loop when things aren't going that flowy. Watching professional sports provides illustrations of how skilled and disciplined athletes can use feedback about unsuccessful performance. For example, in the NBA basketball finals, Michael Jordan had shot 2 for 21 in the first 3 quarters of a game. He came back to make 20 points in the fourth. Jordan didn't need to know his statistics to tell that his game was off. The handling of the ball, the missed timing, and other cues Jordan has learned to pay attention to told him he needed to do something differently. He demonstrated his ability to refocus on his play and to read the game, and turn things around on many occasions. Clear goals. Many athletes and coaches use goal setting to help get where they want to go, both for the long and the short term. But if creating more flow is our aim, then the emphasis falls on clear and not goals. Clarity gives us direction. We know what to do, and we know where to focus our attention while doing it, and therefore increasing our chances to get into flow. This is because clarity of intention helps to focus attention and avoid distraction. What is required is clear, and there is no need to second guess or doubt what one is doing. In our attempt to understand how clear goals impact our attention, I'll take you back to a study in 2003 called the Invisible Gorilla Experiment. The experiment was conducted by 2 leading cognitive psychology researchers, Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons. It's one of psychology's most famous experiments. Simons showed a short film of basketball players passing a ball around a court to his students, and asked them to count the passes. When the film was over, he had one question: how many people saw the gorilla? As it happened, midway through the clip, a guy in a gorilla costume walked to the middle of a circle of the basketball players, beat his chest a few times, then walked off. Most of the students didn't see the gorilla. Simons' invisible gorilla experiment had since been repeated dozens of times, and always with the same result. Not many people see the gorilla. So what's the point? The point is, when the brain is charged with a clear goal, focus narrows considerably. The unimportant is disregarded, and the now is all that is left. In the now, there's no past or future, and a lot less room for all the stuff we're thinking about all day. So when we define clear goals, we replace the chattering voice in our head with in-the-moment attention. Having clear goals for all the components of performance ensures you're paying attention to the relevant cues, and only to them. Chapter 12. External Flow Triggers. The experience we call flow is actually a spectrum of experiences. In a sense, the state is likely any other emotion. You can be in a low-grade microflow state on one end of the spectrum, or a full-blown macro flow state on the other. There are 3 external triggers that make flow more likely to occur: high-risk environments, rich environments, and deep embodiment. Let's dive into these one at a time. High-risk consequences. High consequences are about threats lurking in our environment. It's Hamilton riding the Chopu wave, a high-consequence environment. It's a skier on the edge of a really steep slope. It's Michael Jordan taking a shot in the free throw line in overtime of the NBA playoffs. In whatever case, the high-risk consequence is a built-in feature of the experience, and it always has to do with the environment we place ourselves in. I mentioned risk-taking earlier in relation to the challenge-skill ratio. The main difference here is that risk-taking regarding the challenge-skill ratio is more an internal approach to the task at hand rather than an external quality found in the environment. Whether the risk is in the environment or an inner risk, like pushing the edge of a challenge-skill ratio, it is a serious thing that has to be considered and well understood. Why? Risk plays a considerable role in our ability to play with this trigger for starters. Risk increases the amount of norepinephrine and dopamine in our system. This is also why extreme athletes are often called adrenaline junkies. But very few people actually like the feeling of adrenaline. Stephen Kotler interviewed hundreds of action and adventure athletes in his book The Rise of Superman. He noted that most share professional kayaker Theo Berman's sentiment when he says, "I'm the farthest thing from an adrenaline junkie. I can't stand that feeling. If I'm feeling adrenaline, it means I'm feeling too much fear. It means I haven't done my homework. It means it's time to get out of my kayak to reassess." But near all of them like the rush of dopamine and norepinephrine pumped into our system. Work done by Robert Sapolsky at Stanford shows that the neurochemical spike produced by this high-consequence trigger comes very close in size to the spike produced by substances such as cocaine. It's a nearly 700% boost in dopamine, which leads to a massive boost in focus, which easily drives one into flow. This is a very effective strategy, but as the term suggests, also a hazardous one. It's important to emphasize that the high consequences trigger doesn't necessarily mean physical risk. Taking physical risk being only one of the risks. You can also use emotional risk, social risk, creative risk. It doesn't matter. Rich environment. Our next external flow trigger is rich environment. This flow trigger combines novelty, unpredictability, and complexity, 3 elements that catch and hold our attention. Novelty, for example, is one of our brain's favorite experiences. It's actually hardwired into our brains. Anything new, different, or unusual is bound to catch our attention. From an evolutionary perspective, novelty means that either danger or opportunities lurking in our environments. Since both are crucial for survival, the brain prioritizes the information. Unpredictability means that we don't know what happens next. Thus, we pay more attention to what happens next. Complexity shows up when there's a lot of salient information coming at us at once. This is the experience of the ah moment, where we get so sucked in by the beauty and magnitude of what we're contemplating that time slows down and the moment stretches on into infinity. Put the 3 together, and you have one of the most potent external flow triggers: rich environment. The outdoor retailer Patagonia can give us an excellent example of how they incorporated the rich environment in their philosophy. Because the company is filled with outdoor athletes, and their corporate headquarters sit right on the Pacific, whenever the waves are good, employees are allowed to stop working and go surfing, even when they're on a deadline, even if they're in the middle of a meeting. It's a corporate policy that Patagonia founder Yvon Chouinard famously dubbed as, "Let my people go surfing." Why surfing? Well, the sport has a high likelihood of driving participants into flow because of the combination of novelty, unpredictability, and complexity that is deeply rooted in the sport. In surfing, no 2 waves are the same, but you don't have to be a surfer to experience these highly potent flow triggers. In fact, most of us have some familiarity with a rich environment triggering flow. If you've ever stood before a waterfall and felt awe, well, awe is a state of total absorption and the beginning stage of flow. When sucked in by the incomprehensible complexity of geological timescales and epic beauty, reality pauses, if only for a moment. And in this moment, we taste the pinpoint focus, loss of self-consciousness, and time dilation that are deep zone companions. Deep embodiment. Deep embodiment means paying attention to all the sensory inputs at once. It's kind of a full body awareness. Humans have sensory inputs all over the place. 50% of our nerve endings are in our hands, feet, and face. And more inputs means more data. More data means an overload of the brain with information. Therefore, the explicit system needs to be bypassed, as discussed in part 1 of the book. The brain's explicit system can't process fast incoming information consciously. It's too slow, too inefficient, and too dangerous in many ways. When critical data arrives, there's no time for neurotic debate. Tasks that require real-time sensory-motor integration are best handled by the implicit system, explained Arne Dietrich in a 2011 paper for Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews. Explicit interference into the execution of these kinds of tasks tend to decrease their effectiveness. This is one of the main reasons athletes have so much success getting into flow. Sport demands embodiment. It's built into the environment. And most experts agree, when it comes to deep embodiment, there's little substitute for the physical. By getting into physical activities like skiing, surfing, biking, yoga, tai chi, there's no way the conscious mind can keep up. If you start thinking, you'll fall off or mess up. This is why deep embodiment is such a powerful trigger to find flow. If we want to pull the deep embodiment trigger in less challenging environments, we simply must learn to pay attention to all these input streams. This isn't hard. Zen walking meditation teaches open sense awareness. Balance and agility training, like playing hopscotch or riding ladder drills, enhance proprioception and vestibular awareness. Yoga, tai chi, and just about every martial art blend both together. My personal favorite is an intense form of silent meditation, in which you must be continuously alert and aware throughout. Each meditation lasts for 1 hour and requires you to keep your eyes closed throughout. This forces you to concentrate fully on your breath, skin, and scanning the body's sensation into a state of deep embodiment. In conclusion, we see that flow is more than an optimal state of consciousness, where we feel our best and perform our best. Flow is what makes life worth living. There are moments that stand out from the chaos of the everyday as shining beacons, wrote Csikszentmihalyi in Flow. In many ways, one might say the whole effort of human mankind through millennia of history has been to capture these fleeting moments of fulfillment and make them part of everyday existence. Thank you. Thank you for reading this book. Are you excited? Share the flow theory with others. It's a good way for you to master the material even better. You can also help me enormously to further publicize flow in sport by leaving reviews at places such as Amazon.com and Goodreads.com.